there is a moment just before sleep when the world grows softer. Tonight, imagine that moment stretching into a place. You are walking slowly, barefoot, across cool stone floors. Each step echoes gently, not loud enough to startle, only enough to remind you that this place is real. You have entered an ancient library. Long before electricity, before clocks hummed and phones glowed, humans built spaces like this for quiet. Libraries were designed not for speed, but for stillness. The brain naturally lowers its alertness in quiet, enclosed spaces, especially those with predictable patterns, like rows of shelves and repeating arches. The earliest libraries were often attached to temples. Not because books were sacred, but because silence was. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets were stored in rooms with thick walls that muted sound and heat. The weight of those walls helped regulate temperature, and the human nervous system responds calmly to stable environments. Close your eyes, and let us journey together into the hushed sanctuary of ancient libraries, where time moves slowly, where dust motes dance in slanted light, and where the very air seems to hold its breath in reverence. Long ago, in the ancient world, people understood something profound about the human mind, that it craves order, seeks patterns, and finds deep comfort in the presence of accumulated wisdom. The earliest libraries were not merely collections of texts, but temples of tranquility, designed with the explicit understanding that knowledge and calm were inseparable companions. In the Great Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, the architects knew that the mind settles when surrounded by order. They created reading rooms with high ceilings and smooth limestone walls, understanding that vertical space allows thoughts to expand and relax. The Egyptians discovered that when the eye has room to wander upward, the breath naturally deepens, the shoulders drop, and the racing mind begins to slow. This was no accident. Ancient builders observed that scholars who worked in cramped quarters suffered from what they called confined thought, or restlessness of spirit. But in vast halls, beneath soaring ceilings, the mind found permission to settle. The temperature of these ancient reading rooms was carefully controlled, kept several degrees cooler than the blazing world outside. This coolness served a neurological purpose that the ancients understood intuitively, though they lacked our modern terminology. When the body cools slightly, the heart rate decreases, preparing us for rest. The Library of Alexandria maintained its cool halls through thick stone walls and limited windows, creating an eternal twilight that signaled to every visitor's brain, "Here, you may rest. Here, urgency has no place." The scribes who worked in these libraries moved with deliberate slowness. This was not laziness but wisdom. In the ancient world, before the frenzy of our modern age, people understood that haste agitates the mind, while measured movement calms it. A scribe might spend an entire day copying a single page, his hand moving in rhythmic, repetitive motions that induced a meditative state. The scratch of reed pen on papyrus created a sound like gentle rain, a white noise that masked the chaotic world beyond the library walls. Ancient libraries possessed a distinctive fragrance that neuroscientists today recognize as powerfully calming. The smell of old papyrus, mixed with cedar oil used to preserve manuscripts, created an olfactory environment that signaled safety to the ancient brain. Cedar, in particular, contains compounds that reduce cortisol, the stress hormone. The Egyptians knew this empirically, if not scientifically. They observed that scholars who spent hours surrounded by cedar-treated scrolls emerged calm and centered, their minds clear. In the Library of Pergamum, established in the 2nd century BCE, librarians developed an even more sophisticated approach to scent. They incorporated specific herbs into the binding materials of books: lavender for its sedative properties, rosemary for memory, and frankincense for its ability to slow and deepen breathing. Modern research confirms what these ancient curators knew: that scent bypasses the logical brain and speaks directly to the limbic system, the ancient emotional center of our minds. The dust that settled on these ancient books was not simply dirt but a complex mixture of plant fibers, minerals, and organic compounds. When disturbed, this dust released microscopic particles that, studies now show, contain compounds similar to those found in forest air, triggering the parasympathetic nervous system, our body's rest and digest mode. The ancients called this the breath of the books, believing that old texts exhaled a kind of wisdom that could be absorbed through breathing. The Greeks, in their infinite wisdom, applied mathematical principles to library design, creating spaces that resonated with the human brain's innate preferences. The Library of Celsus, built in the 2nd century CE, was constructed using the golden ratio, a proportion that appears throughout nature and that the human mind finds inherently pleasing and calming. The width of each reading alcove in relation to its height, the spacing between columns, the proportions of doorways, all adhered to this sacred geometry. When you stand in a space designed with these proportions, your brain recognizes a pattern it has encountered in spiraling shells, in the arrangement of flower petals, in the curve of a nautilus. This recognition happens below conscious awareness, triggering a cascade of neurotransmitters associated with safety and well-being. The Romans, practical as always, discovered that libraries built with certain acoustic properties enhanced focus and reduced mental fatigue. The great libraries of Rome were designed with curved walls and domed ceilings that dispersed sound evenly, preventing echoes that might startle a concentrating mind. The ambient sound level in these spaces hovered around 40 decibels, approximately the volume of a quiet library today, a level that research shows is optimal for concentration and calm. In these Roman libraries, reading tables were positioned at precise distances from one another. The architects had observed that humans possess an invisible bubble of personal space, and when this space is honored, the mind relaxes. Too close, and we remain vigilant, our ancient prey animal instincts on alert. At the proper distance, roughly 6 to 8 feet, our nervous system receives the message: you are alone enough to rest, yet not so alone as to be vulnerable. The physical act of reading from ancient books created a rhythm that modern neuroscience recognizes as conducive to meditative states. Unlike our modern screens, which refresh at imperceptible rates that nonetheless keep the brain in a state of subtle alertness, ancient texts were utterly still. The eye moved across them in a smooth, horizontal sweep, a motion that activates the same neural pathways as meditation practices. Scribes in the great Bibliotheca of Constantinople, established in the 4th century CE, developed a particular style of script designed for ease of reading. Each letter was formed with gentle curves, avoiding sharp angles that catch the eye and create micro-moments of stress. The spacing between words was calculated to allow the eye to predict its next landing spot, reducing cognitive load and allowing the mind to drift into that twilight state between waking and sleeping. The weight of ancient books played an unexpected role in their calming effect. A scroll or codex had physical heft, requiring the reader to engage muscles in a gentle, sustained way. This constant, mild physical engagement has been shown to ground attention, preventing the mind from spiraling into anxiety. The Romans noticed that scholars who read while holding texts remained calmer than those who read from lecterns, though they couldn't have known that the gentle muscle tension was triggering a grounding response in the nervous system. Ancient readers often traced their fingers along the lines of text, a practice called tactile reading. The texture of papyrus or parchment under the fingertips provided sensory input that anchored awareness in the present moment. We now know this is a form of what psychologists call mindful grounding, a technique that interrupts rumination and worry by focusing attention on immediate physical sensation. Silence in ancient libraries was not merely the absence of sound but a presence in itself, carefully cultivated and protected. The great library of Ashurbanipal in ancient Nineveh had rules inscribed at its entrance, warning that loud speech was forbidden, that voices must be kept to a whisper. But this was more than a social convention. It reflected a deep understanding of how sound affects consciousness. When we enter a space where others are silent, our own internal dialogue naturally quiets. This is a neurological phenomenon. Our brains are constantly predicting and preparing for social interaction, and in a silent space, these predictive circuits can rest. The ancient librarians created sanctuaries where the mind could stop its constant preparation for speech, for defense, for negotiation, and simply be. The silence of these libraries was deepened by their remoteness. The Library of Ephesus was positioned at the end of a long columned avenue, requiring visitors to walk a significant distance from the noise of the marketplace. This walk served as a transition, a decompression, allowing the agitation of daily life to gradually subside. Modern therapists recognize this same principle in the threshold rituals they recommend for reducing stress. The mind needs space and time to shift between states. Inside the library, the silence was punctuated only by the soft sounds of pages turning, of scrolls being unrolled, of the occasional quiet footfall on stone floors. These sounds, arriving at irregular intervals, created what acousticians now call pink noise, a sound spectrum that promotes deep relaxation and even enhances sleep. The ancient scholars were unknowingly bathing their brains in an acoustic environment optimized for calm and focus. Entering an ancient library was not a casual act but a ritual that prepared body and mind for contemplation. At the Great Library of Trajan in Rome, visitors were required to wash their hands in a ceremonial fountain before touching any texts. This wasn't merely about preserving the manuscripts, it was a threshold ritual, a physical action that signaled to the mind, you are leaving the ordinary world and entering a sacred space. The act of washing hands triggers what psychologists call a reset response. The sensation of water, the deliberate movements, the brief pause, all serve to interrupt the momentum of whatever mental state we're carrying. Ancient peoples understood this intuitively, incorporating water rituals into countless practices designed to alter consciousness. After washing, visitors to many ancient libraries would pass through a series of doorways, each smaller than the last, creating a sense of moving deeper into a protected space. This architectural progression mimics the journey inward that occurs in meditation, each threshold a step away from the external world and its demands. The mind, recognizing this pattern, begins to release its grip on external concerns. Inside, natural light was carefully controlled. Large windows were rare. Instead, light entered through high clerestory windows or small apertures that created pools of illumination without harsh glare. This soft, indirect light reduces eye strain and triggers the brain's association between dimness and rest. Our ancient ancestors spent millions of years in caves and shelters where dim light meant safety, and this deep evolutionary programming still shapes our responses today. One of the most powerful aspects of ancient libraries was the presence of other quiet humans. When we see others in a state of calm focus, mirror neurons in our brain fire, creating a subtle echo of that state within us. A library full of silent readers becomes a chamber of collective calm, each person both contributing to and benefiting from the shared atmosphere. The Great Library at Pergamum could hold hundreds of readers simultaneously, and accounts from ancient visitors describe an almost palpable sense of peace. This was not coincidental but the result of social resonance, a phenomenon where human nervous systems synchronize with one another. When surrounded by calm people, your heart rate variability shifts toward a pattern associated with relaxation. The ancient world knew this as the peace of the many in silence. Librarians in these ancient institutions were trained in what we might now call ambient presence. They moved quietly, spoke rarely, and radiated calm competence. Their very demeanor reassured visitors that this was a safe space, managed by capable guardians. Security, in the psychological sense, is fundamental to the ability to relax, and the presence of these calm authority figures provided exactly that. In some libraries, such as the Serapeum in Alexandria, scholarly monks or priests maintained a constant, near-silent chant in adjacent chambers. This created a baseline of barely audible sound that masked potential disturbing noises from outside while providing a subtle rhythmic element that could entrain brain waves toward alpha states associated with relaxed alertness. The scribes who copied manuscripts in ancient libraries performed their work with a meditative precision that transformed transcription into a spiritual practice. To copy a text by hand required entering a state of focused calm, where each letter was formed with care, each word considered. This practice, similar to the Buddhist practice of copying sutras, induced what neuroscientists now recognize as a flow state, where time seems to stop and the self dissolves into the activity. The materials used for writing contributed to this meditative state. The resistance of papyrus or parchment to the stylus or pen required a certain pressure, a physical engagement that kept the mind anchored in the body. The ink, made from carbon black mixed with gums, had a particular viscosity that slowed the writing process, preventing haste. Every aspect of the physical act enforced a measured, deliberate pace. Scribes often worked in complete silence, communicating only through gestures or written notes. This monastic quiet allowed each scribe to descend into deep concentration, and accounts from ancient writers describe entering states of such absorption that hours would pass unnoticed. The monastery scriptoriums of late antiquity, which preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, elevated this practice to an art form. The illuminated manuscripts created in these scriptoriums featured intricate designs that required months or even years to complete. The painting of a single decorated initial might occupy a scribe for weeks, each microscopic brush stroke a meditation. Modern psychology recognizes such detailed, repetitive work as inherently calming, occupying the worried mind with precise, achievable tasks. Ancient civilizations developed elaborate methods for preserving texts, and these methods created environments that were inherently calming. Scrolls were stored in cylindrical containers called capsae, often made of wood or leather, which gave off subtle scents of oil, leather, and aged wood. These scents, as we've noted, have direct calming effects on the nervous system. The Romans developed a systematic cataloging approach, creating order from potential chaos. Each scroll had a small tag, called a syllabus, that protruded from its container, bearing the title. To walk among these organized, labeled containers was to experience the profound comfort that comes from knowing that information is not lost but preserved, categorized, findable. For an anxious mind, this visible order provides deep reassurance. The temperature and humidity of ancient libraries were carefully controlled through architectural design. Thick walls, small windows, and strategic placement provided natural climate control that kept the interior space cool and dry. This environmental stability had profound effects on occupants. When temperature and humidity remain constant, the body doesn't need to constantly adjust, allowing the autonomic nervous system to settle into a steady state. In winter, some ancient libraries employed a system of heated floors called hypocaust, particularly in Roman facilities. The gentle, even warmth rising from below created an environment of profound physical comfort. Modern sleep research shows that warmth at the feet while the head remains cool promotes the deepest sleep, and ancient peoples seem to have stumbled upon this same principle. Ancient peoples revered old books not just for their content but for the physical transformation that age wrought upon them. A manuscript that had survived centuries acquired a patina, a darkening of the pages, a suppleness in the parchment that new books lacked. This visible age provided a connection to the deep past, and humans find comfort in continuity, in the evidence that the world existed before us and will exist after. The deterioration of ancient books, far from being purely negative, created unique sensory experiences. As parchment aged, it developed a smell variously described as vanilla-like or musty, caused by the breakdown of lignin in the material. This scent has been shown in studies to reduce stress and increase feelings of nostalgia and safety. Libraries filled with aging books became, in essence, aromatherapy chambers. The yellowing of pages, the foxing and spots of age, created a visual texture that modern books lack. The eye, encountering these imperfections, is reminded of the passage of time, of the impermanence of all things. This contemplation of transience, far from being depressing, can be deeply calming, as it places our own concerns in a vaster perspective. Some ancient books were bound in leather that softened with age, becoming supple and warm to the touch. To hold such a book was to hold an object that had been transformed by time, that bore the touch of countless previous readers. This physical connection to the past provided a sense of continuity and belonging that the isolated modern individual often lacks. Ancient libraries were not designed as warehouses but as architectural embodiments of knowledge itself. The famous library in the Pantheon in Rome was circular, a shape the Romans associated with perfection and infinity. To study in a circular room is to be unconsciously reminded that knowledge, like the circle, has no beginning and no end, a thought both humbling and oddly comforting. The shelving systems in ancient libraries followed logical, hierarchical structures. The library at Pergamum, for instance, organized texts by subject, with philosophy at the highest shelves, reflecting its elevated status, followed by history, poetry, and practical texts at lower levels. This physical manifestation of intellectual hierarchy helped scholars understand the relationships between different domains of knowledge, reducing the cognitive load of remembering how information was organized. Reading alcoves in ancient libraries were often semicircular, embracing the reader in an architectural hug. This curved space created a sense of enclosure and protection while still allowing visual connection to the larger room. Modern designers recognize this as a prospect and refuge configuration, satisfying our evolutionary need to feel both safe and aware of our surroundings. The floors of ancient libraries were typically made of smooth stone, often marble, polished to a soft luster. Walking on such floors requires slightly more careful, deliberate movement than walking on rougher surfaces. This enforced deliberation slows us down, making us more mindful of each step, another way the physical environment shaped mental states. In the ancient world, libraries served as one of the few spaces where social hierarchies temporarily dissolved. A wealthy merchant and a poor student, both silent and absorbed in reading, became equals in the eyes of the library. This temporary suspension of social stress, the relief from constant calibration of status and position, allowed the mind to rest in a way that was rare in the ancient world. The clothing worn in libraries was often simple and uniform, further reducing status markers. Some libraries provided reading robes that covered daily attire, creating a visual democracy. When external markers of identity are stripped away, the anxious mind stops its constant social calculations and can simply be. Library rules applied equally to all, and this consistency and fairness created an environment of psychological safety. When we know the rules and know they will be fairly applied, anxiety decreases. The ancient world, often arbitrary and hierarchical, made these islands of predictable order all the more precious. Even emperors, upon entering certain great libraries, were expected to observe the same silence and decorum as the humblest visitor. This humbling of the powerful created an atmosphere where knowledge, not status, was the organizing principle. And for those oppressed by social hierarchy, this was a profound relief. Ancient libraries, lacking electricity, imposed natural limitations on reading time. Sunlight governed when one could read, and as shadows lengthened and light faded, scholars were forced to stop their work. This enforced rest prevented the burnout that comes from unlimited access to information and activity. The scarcity of texts in the ancient world meant that each book was precious, each reading session an event. Modern readers, overwhelmed by infinite options, suffer decision fatigue and attention fragmentation. Ancient readers, with limited choices, could sink deeply into a single text, reading it multiple times, finding new layers with each encounter. This depth of engagement is profoundly more satisfying than the breadth we modern people pursue. The slowness of acquiring knowledge in the ancient world, where books had to be painstakingly copied and were rare and expensive, meant that learning itself was a gradual, meditative process. Information absorbed slowly integrates more deeply, creating stable knowledge rather than the flickering, superficial familiarity we often mistake for understanding today. Ancient scholars often spent years mastering a single text or subject, becoming true experts rather than skimming generalists. This depth of knowledge provided confidence and security, a sense of genuine competence that reduces anxiety. The modern person, knowing a little about much, often feels inadequate. The ancient scholar, knowing much about little, could rest in expertise. Libraries represented humanity's defiance of death and forgetting. Each preserved text was a victory over time, a voice from the past speaking to the present. For anxious minds troubled by mortality and meaning, libraries offered proof that human thought, if recorded, could achieve a kind of immortality. The chain of transmission, the idea that knowledge passed from teacher to student across generations, created a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. To study in a library was to join this chain, to become a link between past and future. This sense of purpose and connection is profoundly calming to the human psyche. Ancient librarians saw themselves as guardians not just of books but of civilization itself. During times of war and upheaval, librarians risked their lives to protect texts, understanding that the loss of knowledge was a loss to all humanity. This elevated sense of mission gave profound meaning to what might otherwise have been mundane work. The repeated copying of texts ensured that even if one library burned, others might preserve the same work. This redundancy, while inefficient, provided resilience. For the anxious mind, there is comfort in knowing that important things are backed up, that single points of failure have been eliminated. Ancient books accumulated marginalia, the notes of previous readers scribbled in borders and between lines. These annotations created a dialogue across time, with readers separated by centuries engaging in the same intellectual struggles. To discover that a question that troubles you also troubled a reader 1,000 years ago is profoundly reassuring. There were patterns on ancient books, the places where pages were most frequently turned, where spines creaked from repeated opening, told stories of past engagement. These physical traces of use provided evidence that you were not the first to seek wisdom in these pages, that you walked a well-worn path. Some ancient libraries maintained reading logs, records of who borrowed what and when. These archives show patterns. Certain texts were consistently popular across generations, while others fell in and out of favor with historical tides. These patterns revealed something about the constancy of human nature, the recurring questions and concerns that transcend era and culture. The binding repairs visible on ancient books, the patches and stitching added over centuries, demonstrated care and continuation. Each repair was an act of hope, a vote of confidence that the text would have future readers worth preserving it for. This optimism, embedded in the physical object, subtly influences those who handle it. Many ancient libraries incorporated gardens or courtyards, recognizing that intellectual work needs to be balanced with natural beauty and fresh air. The Library of Hadrian in Athens featured a large garden courtyard surrounded by reading rooms, allowing scholars to move between concentrated study and restorative time in nature. These gardens were not randomly planted but carefully designed to include plants known for their calming properties: jasmine for its soporific scent, lavender for relaxation, rosemary for memory and mental clarity. The ancients practiced a form of horticultural neuroscience, using plants to shape mental states. Water features were common in library gardens: pools, fountains, small streams. The sound of moving water has measurable effects on brainwave patterns, promoting alpha states associated with relaxed awareness. Scholars who studied near these water features reported improved focus and reduced mental fatigue. Walking paths in library gardens were often labyrinthine, creating gentle, mindful movement that helped scholars process and integrate what they had read. The rhythm of walking, combined with the mental rehearsal of new ideas, is now recognized as an excellent learning technique, but ancient peoples knew this empirically. While libraries were silent, they were not lonely. The presence of other humans engaged in the same quiet pursuit created a sense of fellowship. This paradox of solitude in company is deeply comforting. We are alone with our thoughts yet supported by the presence of others. Some ancient libraries had specific days when scholarly discussion was permitted or encouraged, creating a rhythm of silence in speech, solitude in community. This alternation prevented both the isolation that comes from excessive solitude and the overstimulation that comes from constant social engagement. Master scholars often held informal office hours in libraries, sitting at particular tables where students knew they could be approached with questions. This accessible expertise reduced the anxiety of not understanding, providing a safety net that allowed risk-taking and thought. Library workers, shelvers, and catalogers moved quietly through the space, their presence providing ambient human warmth without demanding interaction. To be cared for without being intruded upon is a kind of ideal human relationship, and libraries provided this. Ancient memory techniques, such as the method of loci, transformed libraries themselves into mnemonic devices. Scholars would mentally place facts they wanted to remember in specific locations within the library, creating a palace of memory that mirrored the physical space. This practice deepened the relationship between scholar and library, making the space itself an extension of the mind. To walk through the library was to walk through one's own memories, each alcove and shelf triggering recall. This integration of self and space created profound comfort and belonging. The organization of knowledge in ancient libraries reflected theories about how the mind organizes information. By externally manifesting these internal structures, libraries became models of the ideal mind, ordered, comprehensive, accessible. To study this order was to study the mind itself. Regular visitors developed such familiarity with library layouts that they could navigate them with eyes closed, their bodies absorbing the spatial relationships. This bodily knowledge, encoded in muscle memory, created a sense of home in the library that was deeper than conscious awareness. As ancient libraries grew more accessible, they began to level intellectual hierarchies. A person of humble birth could, through diligent study, acquire knowledge that rivaled or exceeded that of the wealthy. This social mobility through learning created hope and reduced the despair of rigid caste systems. Free public libraries, established in Rome and other major cities, represented a radical democratic impulse, the idea that knowledge should be available to all citizens, not hoarded by elites. This accessibility transformed societies, creating informed citizenries capable of participating in governance. The mixing of social classes in libraries, all engaged in the same dignified pursuit of knowledge, gradually shifted social norms. Reading became associated not with idle leisure but with virtuous self-improvement, a shift that elevated the activity and those who practiced it. Women, often excluded from formal education, found in some ancient libraries a space where their intellectual interests could be pursued. The library, being a public yet quiet space, provided a socially acceptable venue for female scholarship, slowly eroding gender barriers. Ancient libraries had closing rituals, procedures for securing texts and preparing the space for night. These rituals created a sense of completion, of cycles ending and beginning, that aligned with human circadian rhythms and need for routine. Oil lamps were lit in sequence, creating a gradual transition from natural to artificial light that allowed eyes to adjust slowly. This gradual transition prevented the shock that sudden changes in light level create, maintaining the calm atmosphere even as day ended. Librarians would sometimes read a closing prayer or statement, thanking the texts for their wisdom and committing them to the night's protection. This anthropomorphization of books, treating them as living entities deserving care, reflected a deep respect for knowledge that shaped how people interacted with texts. The act of leaving the library, of returning to the noise and chaos of the city, was itself a transition ritual. Many libraries had a final threshold, a doorway where one paused before re-entering the ordinary world, a moment to carry the library's peace outward. In the library, time moved differently. The texts were often ancient, the building might be new, but the act of reading collapsed these temporal distances. A reader in Rome in 100 CE, reading Homer, was experiencing the same words as a reader in 700 BCE, creating a kind of eternal present where all readers existed simultaneously. This temporal fluidity had a calming effect. It suggested that human experience, despite superficial changes, remained constant in its essentials. The same joys, fears, questions, and insights recurred across centuries, making each reader's concerns part of a larger human story. Ancient peoples, more comfortable with cyclical time than our modern linear conception, saw the library as a place where past and future met in the present moment. This integration of tenses is actually more aligned with how our brains process experience than our modern temporal segmentation. The permanence of inscribed knowledge contrasted with the impermanence of oral tradition, yet libraries preserved both, creating a balance between the fixed and the fluid. This balance, this acknowledgement that some things change while others endure, is psychologically healthy. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself in one of these ancient libraries. Feel the cool stone beneath your feet. Smell the cedar and papyrus, the leather and dust. Hear the whisper of pages turning, the distant scratch of a scribe's pen. See the soft light filtering through high windows, creating pools of gold on marble floors. You are surrounded by thousands of years of human thought, by wisdom in story, by the accumulated knowledge of civilizations. You are safe here. The books stand guard, silent sentinels that have outlasted empires. The walls are thick. The world outside fades. Here, in this space between waking and sleeping, between ancient and modern, between self and other, you can rest. The library holds vigil while you sleep. The texts will be here when you wake, patient and eternal. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the space. Let your thoughts settle like dust motes coming to rest. The library's peace seeps into you, molecular and sure. You are held by something larger than yourself, by the continuity of human seeking and finding. Sleep now, in this sanctuary of silence. Let the ancient calm of libraries carry you into dreams. The books will keep their watch. The wisdom will wait. You are safe. You are home. In the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where ancient knowledge was preserved through centuries of darkness, illuminators developed a visual language that spoke directly to the soul. The gold leaf they applied to manuscript pages was not mere decoration but a technology of light. When candlelight struck these gilded letters, they glowed with an inner radiance, creating focal points that drew the eye and quieted the restless mind. The process of creating gold illumination was itself a meditation. Gold had to be hammered into sheets so thin that light could pass through them, then carefully applied with brushes made from a single squirrel hair. This painstaking work could not be rushed. A single illuminated initial might require days of preparation and hours of application, each moment demanding absolute presence and steadiness of hand. The colors used in manuscript illumination were derived from minerals, plants, and even insects, each requiring elaborate preparation. Lapis lazuli, ground to create the purest blue, had to be imported from Afghanistan at tremendous expense. This precious pigment, worth more than gold, was reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary and the most sacred texts. To see this blue was to witness devotion made visible, wealth transformed into beauty for the glory of knowledge. The red used in many manuscripts came from Kermes insects, tiny creatures that lived on oak trees in the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands of insects were required to produce a single ounce of dye. This crimson, called vermilion, had a warmth and depth that synthetic colors cannot match. Modern neuroscience shows that certain wavelengths of red light can reduce anxiety and promote feelings of safety, and the ancient illuminators, through centuries of practice, had discovered the most soothing shades. The scriptoriums where manuscripts were created had their own microclimate, carefully maintained through architectural design. Small windows, often fitted with oiled parchment rather than glass, filtered light to a soft, diffused glow that reduced eye strain. The air within these chambers moved slowly, barely stirring the flames of oil lamps, creating an environment of almost supernatural stillness. Monks who worked in scriptoriums observed a rule of silence so complete that even the scrape of a chair was forbidden. Communication occurred through a sophisticated system of hand gestures, a sign language that allowed necessary coordination without disturbing the profound quiet. This silence was not empty but full, charged with concentrated attention and reverence for the work. The rhythm of work in a scriptorium followed the liturgical hours, with periods of copying interspersed with times of prayer and contemplation. This alternation between focused mental work and spiritual reflection prevented the mental exhaustion that comes from sustained concentration. Modern productivity research confirms what these monks knew, that the mind works best in cycles of engagement and rest. In winter, scriptoriums were among the few heated spaces in a monastery, warmed by small braziers that had to be carefully tended to prevent smoke from damaging manuscripts. The warmth, the soft light, the complete silence, and the presence of other focused humans created an environment of such profound peace that visitors often reported feeling as if they had stepped outside of time itself. The Great Library of Caliph al-Hakam II in Córdoba, Spain, contained over 400,000 volumes in the 10th century, an almost unimaginable collection for its time. To manage this vast repository, librarians developed cataloging systems of extraordinary sophistication, creating detailed indexes that recorded not just titles and authors but also the physical characteristics of each manuscript, its condition, and even notable passages within. The act of cataloging became a form of scholarship in itself. To properly catalog a book, the librarian had to understand its content, its place in the broader landscape of knowledge, its relationship to other texts. This deep engagement with each volume meant that librarians possessed an intimate knowledge of the entire collection, becoming living indexes who could guide scholars to precisely the information they sought. In the Islamic world, libraries often employed calligraphers whose sole task was to create beautiful catalog cards. These cards, works of art in themselves, transformed the mundane task of organizing into an aesthetic experience. The visual harmony of these catalogs, arranged in decorated boxes, provided another layer of sensory calm for those who consulted them. The physical act of maintaining a catalog, of updating entries and creating new ones, imposed a steady, repetitive rhythm on the librarian's day. This rhythm, like the rhythm of copying manuscripts, induced a state of focused calm. The mind, occupied with precise but not overly demanding tasks, could enter a state of relaxed alertness that neuroscientists now associate with optimal well-being. Ancient libraries recognized that knowledge is not simply acquired but must be absorbed, integrated, understood. Many libraries incorporated what we might now call study chambers, small rooms where a scholar could sit with a single text for hours, days, or even weeks, reading and rereading until understanding deepened from superficial familiarity to genuine comprehension. These study chambers were designed to minimize distraction. Walls were bare, surfaces smooth and unadorned. The only furniture was a simple desk and chair, positioned to receive optimal natural light. This stark simplicity was not ascetic deprivation but intentional design. By removing external stimulation, the mind could turn fully inward, engaging deeply with the text at hand. Some libraries employed what were called walking masters, elderly scholars who would slowly pace the corridors, available to answer questions or engage in discussion. These masters never intruded, but their presence provided reassurance. Help was available if needed, but the primary work of understanding was private, internal, individual. The tradition of the close reading, which we now associate with literary criticism, was born in these ancient study chambers. To read slowly, to pause over difficult passages, to reread sentences until their meaning crystallized, this was understood as the only true way to absorb knowledge. The modern habit of skimming would have been incomprehensible to ancient scholars, a violation of the respect owed to the written word. The great library at Ephesus featured a facade adorned with statues representing the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, knowledge, intelligence, and valor. These statues were not merely decorative but served as a kind of psychological priming, reminding visitors that they entered a space dedicated to the highest human aspirations. Modern psychology confirms that environmental cues shape behavior and cognition, and these ancient architects understood this intuitively. Inside, the library was designed to inspire awe. The ceiling soared 40 feet overhead, decorated with coffers that created geometric patterns pleasing to the eye. The columns supporting this ceiling were carved with intricate designs that rewarded close examination, providing visual interest that could occupy a resting mind without overwhelming it. The reading rooms of Ephesus were positioned to capture the morning light, which neuroscientists now know is crucial for regulating circadian rhythms. Scholars who studied in morning light reported better sleep and improved mood, though they couldn't have known that exposure to certain wavelengths of light at certain times of day entrains the biological clock. The entrance to the library was deliberately grand, requiring visitors to ascend a broad staircase that elevated them above the street level. This ascent was both literal and symbolic, a physical enactment of the intellectual elevation that study provides. The mind, recognizing this symbolism at a subconscious level, prepared itself for serious work. In ancient libraries, texts were not silent objects but were meant to be read aloud. Reading rooms often featured small alcoves with special acoustic properties that allowed a reader to hear their own voice clearly without disturbing others. This practice of vocal reading engaged more of the brain than silent reading, creating stronger memory traces and deeper understanding. The human voice, when reading, naturally adopts rhythms and cadences that mirror the structure of the text. Poetry, in particular, demands to be read aloud, its meters and rhymes creating patterns that the ear recognizes even when the mind does not consciously analyze them. These patterns have measurable effects on heart rate and breathing, often synchronizing bodily rhythms with textual rhythms. Some ancient libraries maintained reading servants, trained performers who would read texts aloud for groups of listeners. These servants understood the texts they read deeply, knowing where to pause, when to emphasize, how to modulate their voices to convey meaning. To listen to a skilled reader was to experience the text in a richer, more embodied way than silent reading alone could provide. The practice of memorizing texts, common in the ancient world, was facilitated by vocalization. By reading a text aloud multiple times, the rhythm and sound of the words became embedded in memory. Scholars could recite entire books from memory, carrying a library within their minds. This internalization of knowledge provided a security and self-sufficiency that the modern reliance on external storage cannot match. Ancient libraries understood the importance of shadows as well as light. Deep shadows in corners and recesses created spaces of mystery and possibility, suggesting that the library contained more than could be immediately seen. This interplay of light and shadow engaged the imagination, inviting exploration and discovery. The progression through a library often moved from brighter public spaces to dimmer private alcoves, mirroring the journey from public knowledge to personal insight. This architectural narrative guided visitors intuitively, without need for explicit instruction. The dimming light signaled, "Here, in this quiet corner, you may think your own thoughts." Candlelight and oil lamps created a quality of illumination entirely different from modern electric light. The slight flicker of flame, far from being a distraction, provided a gentle, irregular rhythm that prevented the kind of blank staring that can occur under steady artificial light. The eye, tracking these minute variations, remained engaged and alert without strain. The golden hour, that time just before sunset when light becomes honey-colored and soft, was considered the most auspicious time for study in many ancient traditions. The warm, diffused light of this hour reduces harsh contrasts, making reading comfortable. The declining light also imposed a natural endpoint to the day's work, preventing the exhaustion that comes from working past the body's natural rhythms. In the great libraries of Byzantium, master craftsmen dedicated their lives to the repair and restoration of damaged manuscripts. This work was considered as noble as the original creation, for it preserved the past and made it available to the future. The tools of the restorer were as refined as those of the original scribe: delicate brushes, specially prepared adhesives, papers matched in texture and weight to the original. The process of restoration required extraordinary patience. A single page might take weeks to repair, each tear carefully aligned and stabilized, each loss carefully filled with matching material. This slow, meticulous work induced a meditative state in the restorer, who became intimately familiar with every fiber of the page, every characteristic of the ink. Restorers worked in specially designed chambers where temperature and humidity were carefully controlled to prevent further damage to fragile materials. These chambers became laboratories of preservation, where techniques were developed and refined over centuries. The knowledge accumulated in these workshops was itself a kind of library, though recorded in practiced hands rather than written words. The philosophy of restoration reflected a profound respect for the past. Rather than attempting to make old books look new, restorers sought to stabilize them in their current state, accepting the marks of age as part of the book's story. This acceptance of impermanence, of honorable aging, provided a model for how humans might relate to their own aging and mortality. In many ancient traditions, the library was understood as a microcosm, a small model of the universe itself. Just as the cosmos was ordered and comprehensible despite its vastness, so too was the library. This metaphor provided comfort. If the library could be understood, navigated, mastered, then perhaps the universe could be as well. The arrangement of books in ancient libraries often reflected cosmological beliefs. In some Islamic libraries, books were arranged to mirror the structure of paradise as described in the Quran, with the most sacred texts at the center and others radiating outward in concentric circles. To move through such a library was to enact a spiritual journey. The Chinese imperial libraries organized books according to the 4 classical divisions of knowledge: classics, history, philosophy, and belles lettres. This fourfold structure echoed other fourfold divisions in Chinese thought: the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, the 4 elements. The repeated pattern created a sense of cosmic order made manifest in the organization of books. Some ancient libraries incorporated astronomical instruments or planetariums, physical demonstrations that knowledge of books and knowledge of the heavens were intimately connected. To study the stars and to study ancient texts were seen as complementary pursuits, both seeking to understand the fundamental order of things. Before the printing press, every book was a unique object, copied by hand. This meant that even the same text existed in multiple versions, each reflecting the understanding, the errors, and the artistic sensibility of the scribe who copied it. Far from being a disadvantage, this variability meant that no 2 readers encountered exactly the same text, encouraging active interpretation rather than passive reception. Scribes often added marginal notes explaining difficult passages or commenting on the content. These clauses became part of the text for future readers, creating a layered document where multiple voices spoke across time. To read such a text was to participate in a conversation spanning centuries, your own thoughts joining those of countless previous readers. The physical effort of copying created a deep familiarity with the text. A scribe who had copied a work word by word, letter by letter, knew it in a way that a casual reader never could. This intimate knowledge transformed the scribe, who absorbed not just the information but the rhythm, the style, the very spirit of the text. In some monastic traditions, copying texts was understood as a form of prayer, each perfectly formed letter an offering to the divine. This sanctification of labor elevated what might have been tedious work into something transcendent. The scribe's hand became an instrument of transmission, connecting the divine wisdom of the text to the earthly realm of the reader. Ancient libraries existed within broader ecosystems of learning. Attached to many great libraries were schools, gardens, observatories, and discussion halls. This clustering created communities of scholars who shared ideas, challenged each other's thinking, and collectively advanced human understanding. The library was not an isolated repository but a living center of intellectual exchange. In Alexandria, the library and the adjacent Mausoleon Museum formed a complex that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean world. These scholars were provided with stipends, housing, and exemption from taxation, allowing them to devote themselves fully to study. This institutional support recognized that the production of knowledge requires sustained attention and freedom from material anxiety. The conversations that occurred in the colonnades and gardens surrounding ancient libraries were as important as the texts within. Ideas encountered in books were tested, debated, refined through dialogue. This social dimension of learning prevented the isolation that can occur when study becomes purely solitary, and it created accountability, as scholars knew their ideas would be scrutinized by peers. Libraries also served as neutral ground where scholars of different philosophical schools or religious traditions could meet and exchange ideas. The library's commitment to preserving all texts, not just those conforming to a single viewpoint, created an atmosphere of intellectual pluralism. This exposure to diverse perspectives, far from creating confusion, actually strengthened understanding by forcing scholars to articulate and defend their positions. Water clocks, called clepsydra, were common features in ancient libraries, marking time through the steady drip of water from one vessel to another. Unlike mechanical clocks with their regular ticking, water clocks measured time silently, their passage marked only when one checked the water level. This created a different relationship with time, less anxious and more fluid. The division of the day in ancient libraries often followed natural cycles rather than arbitrary units. Study might begin at dawn, pause at midday for rest and meals, resume in the afternoon, and end as light faded. This alignment with solar rhythms kept human activity in harmony with biological needs, preventing the disruption that occurs when artificial light extends the day indefinitely. Some libraries maintained hourglasses, beautiful objects of blown glass filled with fine sand. The visible flow of sand created a meditation on the passage of time, its granular descent a reminder of impermanence. Yet paradoxically, watching the sand fall could induce a timeless state, the mind becoming absorbed in the steady, inevitable flow. The concept of library time suggested that time within the library moved differently than time outside. Hours could pass unnoticed when absorbed in reading, or a brief moment of insight could feel eternal. This malleability of subjective time is now understood as a characteristic of flow states, but ancient peoples experienced it as a kind of magic inherent to places of learning. Ancient books were often described in bodily terms. They had spines, they could be injured, they required care and feeding. This anthropomorphization reflected a deep truth. Books are not inert objects but living repositories of human thought and feeling. To interact with a book was to interact with another mind, and the reverence shown to books was really reverence for the humans who created them. The practice of kissing sacred books, common in many religious traditions, expressed this intimate relationship. The book was not merely consulted but cherished, its physical presence comforting. In some traditions, if a book fell to the ground, it was kissed upon being retrieved, an apology to the book itself. This tenderness toward objects of knowledge cultivated a general tenderness of spirit. Books were believed to have preferences, to reveal themselves more readily to some readers than others. A text that seemed opaque to one scholar might suddenly become clear to another, not because of different intelligence but because of different readiness. This belief encouraged patience. If a book did not yield its secrets immediately, one should set it aside and return later, when one had grown into greater understanding. The physical handling of books created a kinesthetic dimension to learning. The weight of a book in the hands, the texture of its pages, the smell of its materials, all created multisensory memories that reinforced the content. Modern research confirms that embodied cognition, learning that engages the body as well as the mind, creates stronger and more durable memories than purely abstract learning. Many ancient books contain dedications tracing the book's lineage, from which earlier book it was copied, which scholar commissioned the copying, which library previously held it. These provenance records created a sense of the book as an inheritance, passed down through generations, each holder a temporary custodian responsible for passing it forward. The concept of intellectual inheritance extended beyond individual books to entire fields of knowledge. A scholar studying mathematics understood themselves as inheriting the work of Euclid, Archimedes, and countless others. This sense of standing on the shoulders of giants created both humility and confidence, humility in recognition of one's debts, confidence in being part of a proven tradition. Libraries sometimes held ceremonies when a significant new text was acquired, formal events where the book was welcomed into the collection. These ceremonies recognized that each book enriched the whole, that the addition of new knowledge was an occasion for communal celebration. This public acknowledgement of learning's value reinforced cultural priorities and inspired continued scholarship. The practice of willing one's personal library to a public institution ensured that private scholarship enriched the public good. Many great libraries grew through such bequests, each donation representing a life devoted to learning. To know that one's books would outlive oneself and serve future scholars provided a kind of intellectual immortality, a legacy more enduring than material wealth. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, translators worked to render Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic, creating a golden age of cultural exchange. These translators understood that translation was not mere word-for-word substitution but required deep comprehension of both source and target cultures. A good translation was itself a creative act, a bridge between civilizations. The process of translation often revealed ambiguities and complexities in the original text that casual reading missed. Translators had to make decisions about subtle shades of meaning, choosing among multiple possible interpretations. This careful analysis often led to commentary and explication, with translated texts arriving embedded in layers of interpretation. Multilingual libraries, housing texts in various languages, created extraordinary opportunities for comparative study. Scholars could examine the same philosophical concept as expressed in different languages and traditions, discovering both universal patterns and culturally specific insights. This cross-cultural fertilization advanced knowledge in ways that monolingual study could not. The humility required for good translation, the recognition that perfect equivalence between languages is impossible, taught a broader lesson about the limits of knowledge. If even human languages could not perfectly map onto each other, how much more mysterious was the relationship between language and reality itself? This epistemological humility prevented dogmatism and encouraged openness to multiple perspectives. As daylight faded and reading became difficult, ancient libraries transitioned to evening activities. Some held readings or lectures, allowing scholars to share their findings with peers. These evening gatherings created community, transforming the solitary work of the day into collective celebration of learning. Other libraries observed a ritual closing, with librarians moving through the space ensuring that all texts were properly stored, all lamps safely extinguished. This careful securing of the space each evening created a rhythm of opening and closing, of access and protection, that mirrored the rhythm of waking and sleeping in human life. Some scholars preferred to work in the evening, finding that their minds operated differently after sunset. The darkness outside created a cocooning effect, narrowing focus to the illuminated page. The silence of the night, when the city slept, provided even deeper quiet than the library's daytime hush. These night scholars became almost mythical figures, devoted seekers who pursued knowledge while others dreamed. The transition from study to sleep was itself treated as important in many ancient traditions. Books were not to be read immediately before bed, as the mind needed time to settle from intellectual excitement into receptive rest. Instead, the evening hours might be given to gentle reflection, to walking in a garden, to quiet conversation, allowing the day's learning to settle into memory while the body prepared for restorative sleep. And so we return, full circle, to where we began, the library as sanctuary, as refuge, as a place where the worried mind can rest. All these elements we have explored, the architecture and the scent, the silence and the light, the ritual and the routine, the company of other quiet souls and the solitude of deep thought, all of these combine to create an environment optimized for human flourishing. The ancient librarians, architects, and scribes who created these spaces understood something essential, that humans need places of peace, islands of order in a chaotic world. They built these sanctuaries with care and intention, considering how every element would affect those who entered. Their work across millennia has given us not just books but the spaces to read them, not just information but the calm required to transform information into wisdom. As you rest now, in this moment between waking and sleeping, you carry within you the essence of these ancient libraries. The peace they offered is not bound to their physical spaces but lives in the memory and imagination of all who have encountered them. You can summon that peace whenever you need it, recreating in your mind the cool stone floors, the scent of old paper, the weight of a book in your hands, the profound silence filled with whispered wisdom. The library, in the end, is not a building but a state of mind, calm, receptive, curious, at peace. It is available to you always, this inner sanctuary where knowledge is honored and the questing spirit can rest. Carry it with you as you drift into dreams, this gift from the ancient world, this promise that learning and serenity are not opposed but intimately connected, two aspects of the same human hunger for understanding and peace.